Thank you very much, Amanda and Nikki. Very powerful testimony. We're going to move now to a debate between economists John Lott and Colin Goddard from the Brady campaign. John and Colin? John R. Lott Jr. is the author of More Guns, Less Crime. A greatly expanded third edition of the book was released last year by the University of Chicago Press, as well as The Bias Against Guns. Lott has held positions at the University of Chicago, Yale University, Stanford, UCLA, Wharton, and Rice, and was the chief economist at the United States Sentencing Commission during 1988 and 1989. Lott has published over 90 articles in academic journals. He is also the author of Freedomnomics, as well as 3 other books and 2 other upcoming books. Lott is a FoxNews.com contributor and has a weekly column for them. Opinion pieces by Lott have appeared in such places as The Wall Street Journal, The New York Times, The Los Angeles Times, The New York Post, USA Today, and the Chicago Tribune. He has appeared on such television programs as the ABC and NBC National Evening News Broadcast, Fox News, and The Today Show. He received his Ph.D. in economics from UCLA in 1984. In addition, Colin Goddard from the Brady campaign to prevent gun violence, in his biography here. Colin's whole life changed after surviving the Virginia Tech massacre on April 16, 2007. The worst shooting in American history. Born in Nairobi, Kenya, to both English and American parents working in international development, Goddard has lived in Somalia, Bangladesh, Indonesia, the USA, and completed high school in Cairo, Egypt. After graduating with a BA from Virginia Tech, Goddard worked in Virginia state government and spent a year teaching English in a high school in France. While enrolled as a 4th-year student in Virginia Tech, pursuing an international studies degree, Goddard was shot 4 times and was 1 out of 7 out of a class of 17 to survive the shooting. Goddard had 3 of the bullets still in his body, as well as a titanium rod implanted in his left femur. Working at the Brady campaign to prevent gun violence, Goddard now uses his experience to educate others about gun violences and the weaknesses in U.S. gun laws. Goddard appears in interviews with numerous media outlets, radio stations, and talk shows, and writes the Huffington Post blog, Goddard on Guns, with his father, Andrew. The story of how Goddard became involved in gun violence prevention is documented in the film Living for 32. Goddard now lives and works in Washington, D.C. for the Brady campaign to prevent gun violence. We will have a debate here, and each side will speak for 18 minutes, followed with a 4-minute rebuttal from each side. Dr. Lott will lead off. Dr. Lott?
Well, it's great to be here. I'm glad to see the crowd here. Guns make it easier for bad things to happen, but they also make it easier for people to protect themselves and prevent bad things from happening. And I think the ultimate question that concerns everybody is, what's the net effect? And when we're talking about these types of gun-free zones where you ban guns from places, there's a large variety of different types of gun-free zones that we have. But I can't find a place where we ban guns, whether it be a city or a state or a country type area, where murder rates have gone down. You'd think you could at least find one place where we've had a ban on guns where we could point and see a drop. But what we see time after time is at least some small increase, or sometimes very large increases in murder rates after bans have come into place. And there's a large variety of gun-free zones that we have. I mean, Americans are familiar, obviously, with the gun bans that we had in Washington, D.C., here in Chicago for decades. But there are other things. Pilots, for example, for a while, were not allowed to carry guns on planes. I was a consultant for several of the pilots' unions after 9/11 when they were trying to be able to carry guns on planes. And it kind of taught me some things about the debate, because what you would see is people would kind of assume that whatever the rules are right now that are in place, that those have always been the rules. And in fact, you take something like pilots. Pilots were mandated, commercial airline pilots were mandated to carry loaded handguns with them when they flew from the mid-1920s until 1963. From 1963 to 1979, they were allowed to carry concealed handguns with them, and according to the pilots' unions, you'd have about 10% or so of the pilots would regularly carry handguns with them. But you go and you listen to the debate about concealed handguns in planes, and a lot of the discussions would be, well, what would happen if? What would happen if a pilot would lose his temper and shoot the other pilot on the plane? Or what would happen if a pilot accidentally fired his gun and put a hole in the fuselage? The thing is, for a lot of these questions, we didn't have to guess what would happen. We had 40-some years where they were mandated to do it, and another couple decades after that where they were allowed to do that. You know, every commercial airline plane for those decades would have a pilot on it who was able to go and carry a concealed handgun or mandated to do it. And yet if you went through the old Civil Aeronautics boards or the FAA records, despite all those decades of experience, you could not find one single example where something bad had happened. You know, you take something like the bans in DC and Chicago, and we'll go through some more detailed numbers in a minute, but I think a lot of Americans realize that those experiments didn't work very well. Crime rates went up immediately after the bans went into effect, and they've fallen immediately after the bans have been rescinded. Now, a lot of gun control advocates will go and claim, well, that those gun bans really weren't fair tests. Because unless you go and you ban guns every place, criminals will go and get guns from some other area and take them into the areas that have the gun bans. Problem is, that may explain why you didn't see a drop, but it's not going to explain why you saw an increase in crime. And in both of those places, we saw huge increases in violent crime occurring. The other problem is, there are lots of places around the world where entire countries, indeed entire island nations, have gun bans. They have no neighbor that they can go and blame for being able to supply guns. And yet you see the same pattern occur time after time in terms of increases in violence, murder rates, and other types of violent crimes. You know, there are many areas in life, besides just the pilots, that we see these gun-free zones. College campuses are one particular area. I mean, I've been an academic virtually all of my adult life. I have a couple kids who are in universities right now. So this isn't something that I take particularly lightly. But the question, again, we have to answer is what types of factors are going to be most likely to reduce these attacks? Now, I'm going to show you just some fast data. If we had a PowerPoint here or something, or more time, I'd go through a lot more slides. But just look at DC and Chicago. DC's handgun ban went into effect in February 1977. If you look at the top 50 cities, prior to the ban going into effect, DC's murder rate would rank someplace between about 15th and 20th in the country. After the ban went into effect, in half the time it was either number 1 or number 2 among the top 50, and over 2/3 of the time it was in the top 4. There's no comparable time prior to the ban where it was anywhere near as remotely high as it was afterwards. So another way of looking at it is just to see how DC's murder rate compares relative to the average for the other 50 cities. Prior to the ban going into effect, DC's murder rate was falling. The ban goes into effect right here, this line, and it rises. And for the period after the ban, it's about 40% higher on average than it was prior to the ban going into effect. This takes it right up to the early 80s. There was a huge increase in DC's murder rate compared to other cities in the late 80s. You basically have the crack cocaine epidemic that affected DC much more than other places. We can go through a lot of arguments. It could be that people weren't able to defend themselves as well here. They could have caused it. But even ignoring the crack cocaine epidemic, you still have, even before that, an immediate about 40% increase in murder rates after DC's handgun ban went into effect. What's interesting is what happened after the Supreme Court decision in June 2008. In 2009, DC's murder rates had fallen by about 23%. In 2010, they fell by another 8.4%. These are large drops. I mean, DC's murder rate went from 186 murders a year in 2008 to 144 in 2009 to 132 in 2010. That basically brought DC's murder rate back down to where it was in 1966. Nationally, we had drops in murder rates over the same period of time, but they were just a fraction of what they were in DC. About 7.3% in 2009 and about 4% in 2010. The interesting thing is that if you actually look month by month and compare the first 7 months of 2008, right before the ban, 2009 after, first 7 months of 2010, because murder rates vary over the course of the year. You have a lot more murders during the summer than you do during the fall or winter. And so you want to kind of compare apples to apples. But if you do that, in the 2 years after the ban, DC's murder rate had fallen by about 36% relative to what it was prior to the ban. That dramatically outpaces the drop by about over 5-fold that you see in the rest of the country for similarly sized cities. And the other interesting thing is crimes involving guns fell much faster, several times faster than you had crimes with guns during that same period of time, where supposedly it was easier for people to get guns. Now, one thing to mention, it wasn't just the gun ban that changed, because they still haven't legalized or licensed too many people to carry or have handguns. The big thing there, I think, was that you no longer mandated people to keep their guns unoperational, locked. Before, it was a felony to actually load a bullet in the chamber of a gun here in the District of Columbia. And there's about 72,000 people that had registered long guns in the city, about a third, amazingly, about a third of the adult population. After the Supreme Court decision, it then became legal for people to be able to use guns defensively, whereas it wasn't beforehand. Now in Chicago, you see a very similar pattern. Chicago's handgun ban went into effect in November 1982. And if you compare Chicago's murder rates over time to the other 10 largest cities, you'll see in the years prior to the ban, Chicago's murder rate was falling dramatically relative to these other cities, basically going from about 50% higher than those other cities to being slightly below the average in the other top 10 largest cities right before the ban went into effect. After the ban went into effect, it stopped falling, and there's no year after the ban went into effect where the murder rate was as low in Chicago as it was prior to the ban going into effect. Much higher, almost doubling over part of this period of time. And you can also compare Chicago's murder rate to neighboring counties. There's 6 counties that border Chicago. Not all counties reported murder rates in 1983, or 1984, excuse me. But you can see prior to the ban in Chicago, Chicago's murder rate was falling a little bit relative to those other counties, and then afterwards it rose dramatically. And you can control in both DC and Chicago's case for many other factors, hundreds of factors, and you're still going to basically get the same pattern. As I mentioned, it's not just DC and Chicago. You can look around the world. Time after time, you're going to see increases in murder rates. Here's Ireland's murder rates. Ireland's gun ban went into effect in 72. You can see how the murder rates were bouncing around before that, but within a relatively narrow range. As soon as the ban went into effect, we see a huge increase in murders, and by the end of the period, it's about 8 times higher than it was prior to the ban going into effect. You can look at Jamaica. Jamaica's murder rate now is about 10 times higher than what it was prior to what the ban was, what it was when the ban went into effect. You can see the huge increase that started right at the time that the gun ban went into effect. Excuse me, sorry about that. And this is finally the United Kingdom. You can see how its ban went into effect in January 1997. Murder rate was fairly flat prior to the ban going into effect, or the homicide rate, excuse me. On average, it's about 30% higher afterwards than it was prior to that. It's come down at the end here, but it's still slightly higher than it was at the beginning, but there's obviously some increase there. Now, you know, we can go on and look at other countries there. You're going to see the same pattern time after time, not just in the UK, Jamaica, Ireland, these island nations where we've had complete bans on guns. But it raises the question, why do we see these bans? Or why do we see these increases in murder rates? And the problem is, and you have to ask this when you deal with gun control questions generally, is who is going to obey these laws? Because if it turns out that it's basically the law-abiding good citizens who obey these bans, and not the criminals, what you unintentionally do is make it easier for the criminals to go and commit the crimes, because they have less to worry about in terms of a potential victim being able to defend themselves. Just as you can deter criminals with higher arrest rates or higher conviction rates or longer prison sentences, the fact that a would-be victim might be able to defend himself can also make it costlier for criminals to go and engage in crimes. And the problem is that rather than repelling crime by having these bans, you actually make it more attractive for criminals to go and commit these crimes because they have less to worry about. And let's just think a tiny bit more about who obeys these gun bans. Take something like the Virginia Tech case, which Colin will talk about. If I have a permanent concealed handgun in the state of Virginia, I can take it virtually any place in the state. You know, 99.8 or 7% of the state I'm allowed to go and take the concealed handgun into. There are very tiny areas within the state, university property, being one of the few areas where I'm not allowed to be able to take it. If I'm a professor and I take it in there and I get caught for doing it, what's going to happen? I'm going to get fired. Getting fired for a firearms-related violation by a university, what do you think that would do to that person's academic career? It'd be over. I mean, the likelihood of that person getting another academic job in the United States would be essentially zero for that type of violation. That's a huge penalty for them. For a student, if they got caught doing that, they'd get expelled. Good luck trying to get into another university in the country with a firearms-related violation on campus on your record for why you got expelled from another school. Those are real penalties, life-altering penalties for those types of individuals. Think of the situation, though, for the killer who killed 32 people in Virginia Tech. That person there in that case, you know, it's hard to believe that even if we had a 3-year prison term like we have for some other types of gun-free zones there, that even if he had lived, which he didn't in this case, that something like that could matter. You know, here's somebody who, if he had lived, would have been facing 32 death sentences, or 32 life sentences plus other additional penalties. The notion that somehow, even if you had had a 3-year prison term, it would have said that 3-year prison term, or let's say just the threat of expulsion, you know, saying, having to tell his parents, so I faced 32 death penalties, but I just couldn't tell my parents that I'd also gotten expelled from school. Just wouldn't be a real penalty for this person. When we're talking about crimes, the notion of marginal deterrence, how much more we can penalize that person for the additional crime that they do is extremely important. Bill Landis and I looked at all the multiple, at the University of Chicago, looked at all the multiple victim public shootings in the United States from 1977 through 1999. And what we found was pretty dramatic. We looked at 13 different types of gun control. We looked at many different types of law enforcement policy and strategies. Normal law enforcement didn't affect the rate of multiple victim public shootings. And there's a pretty simple reason for that. About 75% of the times these crimes are committed, the killers themselves die at the scene. And the other 25%, if you look at interviews afterwards, they all thought they were going to die. The reason why they didn't die usually is because they just couldn't bring themselves to commit suicide. And so law enforcement works by punishing people after the fact. So if you're one of these criminals, and I go and I tell you, well, the probability of execution is going to increase, or the length of prison time upon being caught is going to increase, They don't think it's relevant, and it doesn't have the deterrent effect because they don't perceive themselves being around to have to face that type of penalty. Of the 13 different types of gun control laws that Bill and I looked at, only one affected the rate of multiple victim public shootings, and that was the passage of right to carry laws. When states passed right to carry laws, there was about a 60% drop in multiple victim public shootings, and about a 78% drop in the rate at which people were killed or injured in these attacks. And to the extent to which these attacks still occur, they overwhelmingly took place in the gun-free zones, such as Virginia Tech. In fact, if you look over the history of these things, there's only one multiple victim public shooting where more than 3 people that have been killed that's been taking place in an area where permanent concealed handguns are allowed. You can find lots and lots of cases where you have large multiple victim public shootings, and time after time they're taking place where permanent concealed handguns are not allowed, where you have gun bans, where so-called safe zones are occurring. And it's just not in the United States. Europe, most people may not realize this, but even before the Norwegian attack, Europe has had, over the last decade, about the same rate of multiple victim public shootings per capita as the United States does. It's just that most people don't realize it because they think of each country separately there. So, you know, Finland has had a couple big shootings, a university and a mall shooting within just the last 14 months, or I guess 16 months or so. You've had big attacks. You just had the big attack in Norway, but about a year ago you had over 10 people killed in England with a taxi cab driver shooting people. You've had multiple attacks in France over the last decade. Italy's had a couple attacks. Even Switzerland has had a couple big attacks. One case, 14 people were killed at a parliamentary canton of Zug. One thing that's interesting, it's one of the few gun-free zones in Switzerland where those attacks occur. So, how much time do I have left?
Dr. Lott, we're at time.
Okay, well, let me just summarize one thing. We should have something to warn people of time. But just here, you know, one of the big things is what's the behavior of permit holders. You know, what you find is that permit holders are extremely law-abiding. They lose their permits at hundreds or thousands of 1 percentage point for any type of firearms-related violation. And that rate of revocation is the same across age groups. It really doesn't matter. And, well, I'll let it go, but the bottom line is the people who benefit the most from being able to carry concealed handguns are typically the most vulnerable. Women, such as the ones who talked in the first panel, who are relatively weaker physically, the elderly, as well as poor blacks who live in high crime urban areas. Thank you very much.